In the previous video, we set up all the elements that we wanted to use in our pattern and we created the composition. In this video, we are going to finalize this pattern and save it as a swatch. So it might be good to zoom out a bit, so Command or Control minus, and see the actual pattern from a distance. It's good to spot mistakes from this far. And what I normally do here is I turn off the dim copies just to check it how it looks. And I also normally turn off the show tile edge. That way I don't actually see the borders of my tile. So if I feel something overpowers the pattern from this distance, I would make amends to it. Maybe the compass here might be a little bit too big, so I can reduce that in size. And maybe even the backpack can be reduced slightly in size and then moved around. But generally, I'm quite happy with the result, so I can move on. But before we save this, I wanted to show you that you also have an option to change the tile type. Now that's also a cool thing. You can have it kept in grid mode, the way it is right now, or you can use brick by row, which will shift each row based on the offset you use here. So you can have half or third or quarter and so on and so forth. This can give a little bit even more variety to your pattern, which can help. So I use this quite often. But of course, when you use a brick offset, you should double check whether your tile is actually working. So in this case, I would move this map around because it's now overlapping too much in the background. You also have brick by column or even hex by column and hex by row. Just so you can see, I turn on the tile edge and that shows you that it's a hexagon that is going to be repeated. I'm going to switch back to the grid mode. I think it worked perfectly fine with that. And the key with pattern design is that you are trying to make the repeats less obvious. So the less you can spot the repeats, the better. Of course, my pattern is quite obvious, so we can see the repeats. But if I worked a little bit more on it, I add a bit more layering and maybe increase the size of my tile and add more elements in, it would be less easy to find the pattern edges. But for now, I'm quite happy with the result. So before I save it, there's one very important last step here, is to turn off the rectangle that you used as a background preview. I don't like to keep that within the pattern, so it can stay there, but make sure you turn it off. So just simply hide it. And then you can go up here and say done. So once you click on done, what happens is that your pattern is saved as a new pattern swatch, which will show up here in the swatches panel. So what I normally do as a next step is to use the rectangle tool and draw a square. Holding down Shift key, you can draw a square or even a rectangle, it doesn't really matter. And once you have your rectangle ready and the fill color is selected, then click on the new pattern that you just created. So here's our pattern. Let me zoom a bit closer, and it looks quite nice, but we don't have the background color that we wanted to use. And this is where I would come to the appearance panel to edit. So at the moment, the pattern itself is a fill, but what we need is another fill. So I'm going to click on add new fill and make sure that the one below, so there will be two fills, the one at the bottom is the one that I'm going to change. So having that selected, I use the eyedropper tool and I click on the same color that I had originally planned. So you can see the appearance panel now has the fill with the pattern and below the other fill with the simple color that I had. And this is the best way of setting up the pattern, because keeping a full background rectangle within the pattern makes it more difficult to update the background color. So if I ever change my mind, here I can easily change the fill color. So I'm just going to save this one. But if I want to change it and test it out with my other colors, I can very easily do that. So if I then want to go back to the original one, I can choose it. And one last thing I wanted to mention is that when you have a pattern swatch being used on an object, there is an option that controls whether it's going to be stretched or simply increasing the area in which it repeats. So you can find this within the transform options. So when you click on transform on the top, you might not see transform here if your screen is big. You might just see these values. But in that case, you just go to window and choose transform, which opens up the panel itself. And what you are looking for is the panel menu of the transform panel, where you will find the transform options, transform object only, pattern only, or transform both. What I like to use is the transform object only. If I select that, now changing the rectangle on which I have my pattern will simply just increase the area and continues the pattern instead of distorting it or scaling it. And if you want to go back to make amends to your pattern, what you need to do is to go to the swatches panel and simply double click on the pattern you created. Notice that I clicked outside, so I'm not changing anything on this object that I use as a preview. Instead, I just select that pattern swatch, double click on it, and then I'm back to the way it was. So I can go into my layers, turn on the preview background, which I'm actually going to change to the same swatch, just so it looks exactly the same. And then once I made my changes, I can turn it back off again and just simply say done. Or you can even save it as a copy if you want to have multiple versions. And that's all you need to know about creating patterns in Illustrator. So make sure you practice this because it's a very useful tool. And when you went through everything that we talked about in this video, you can move on to the next one, in which again I'm going to talk about an amazing feature called Gradient Mesh.